Cartels are illegal, and when we think of cartels, we usually think about some entities doing some things not allowed by the law, maybe dealing some sort of suspicious objects or selling some sort of suspicious merchandise. But the world's biggest cartel actually doesn't do any of that, and in fact, it is extremely legal. What's more is that it controls the biggest and most important natural resource on the planet, oil, also called liquid gold, necessary for everything, creating energy, transportation, manufacturing goods and services, literally anything that you can think of runs on oil, and the world's biggest cartel controls that, also called OPEC. How did we get to this point, and why is such a cartel even allowed? For this, we have to go back to the 1950s in fact. During the mid-20th century, the global oil market was largely controlled by a handful of Western multinational companies, also called the Seven Sisters. These companies included Exxon, Shell, and British Petroleum, amongst other companies, and they dictated the terms of oil production and pricing, often at the expense of oil-producing countries, favoring oil-consuming countries. A lot of people thought this was a remnant of colonialism, where the wealth generated from natural resources was often in some way used to benefit the West. In the 1950s though, oil-producing countries began to notice this, and they noticed a decline in revenues they received from oil exports. This, while demand for oil was increasing rapidly, set off alarms for these nations. This was the fundamental reason for the founding of OPEC. Since they produced oil, they wanted more control over the pricing and also to stabilize oil markets. By coordinating production levels amongst member countries, they aim to prevent price fluctuations caused by overproduction or underproduction. By creating a more stable market, controlling the most important resource in a very unstable region, they wanted this to benefit both producers and consumers. And also they were tired of the dominance of Western oil production companies and wanted sovereignty over their own natural resources. And thus OPEC was born, established on September 14th, 1960 in Baghdad, Iraq, with the founding members being Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Also called the Baghdad Conference, they laid the groundwork for the organization's structure and objectives. The initial goal was to nationalize oil, i.e. have government control over the supply of oil. And by the 1970s, several OPEC members had taken steps to nationalize their industries. For example, in 1973, Saudi Arabia began the process of acquiring full control over Aramco, which had previously been managed by a consortium of American oil companies. Similarly, Iraq also followed and nationalized their industry in 1972, removing Western companies from the oil sector altogether. By having better control and nationalizing these industries, OPEC could then focus on negotiating better terms with the Seven Sisters. They successfully pushed for higher royalties and better revenue sharing agreements for its members, and these victories in negotiations helped OPEC's reputation as a powerful player in the global oil market. But this also relates its ability to operate as a cartel, an organization that seeks to control production levels and prices to benefit only its members. This is the key thing to note here, is that they wanted to control prices, not reduce or increase prices, but control prices to maximize their own profit. And typically, cartels do this through production quotas, and this is exactly what OPEC did. Setting quotas is one of OPEC's primary tools for controlling oil prices. The quotas determine the maximum amount of oil each member is allowed to produce over a specific period of time, usually adjusted during OPEC's regular meetings. By controlling this total output of oil, OPEC can influence global supply levels, which in turn affects prices. If global demand for oil rises, OPEC can increase production quotas to prevent prices from skyrocketing. Conversely, if demand falls, OPEC can reduce quotas to prevent prices from plummeting. Although OPEC claims it does this for market stabilization so that its member countries and also consumers don't face a sharp rise and sharp fall in the price of oil, this behavior is also called profit seeking, where they're controlling prices and quotas only to benefit themselves. And history suggests that. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, smash the like button and the subscribe button if you enjoy learning more about money, how to make more, save more, or just better understand it. The 1973 oil embargo is one of the most famous examples of OPEC's use of production quotas. In response to the Yom Kippur War and Western support for Israel, OPEC members led by Saudi Arabia significantly reduced oil production. This reduction caused prices to quadruple, leading to a global energy crisis. The embargo demonstrated OPEC's ability to use production quotas as a powerful political and economic tool. And we don't even have to go that far back to see how OPEC uses production quotas. In April 2020, OPEC Plus which is OPEC plus Russia, agreed to cut production by 9.7 million barrels per day, the largest reduction in history, to counter the sharp drop in global oil demand due to travel restrictions. This once again prevented the complete collapse in oil prices, benefiting the OPEC nations over people actually consuming oil, because as you can imagine, many countries could have bought oil for much cheaper than they bought it for if they had let market decide demand and supply and not themselves. And if you're thinking, why does someone not just cheat, quote unquote, and just supply oil? It's because OPEC is extremely cautious with how it monitors its members. Regular meetings, data sharing, and even diplomatic pressure is used to make sure that people are compliant. And what's more is that the quota is adjusted to make sure that most nations in OPEC often profit. They take into account economic growth, technological advancement, geopolitical events, and even shifts in energy consumption patterns to make sure they're able to make as much profit as possible. And this can be seen clearly in its membership count. They have 13 members, primarily in the Middle East, Africa, and South America, and these countries collectively hold around 80% of the world's proven crude oil reserves and account for around 30 to 40% of global oil production. So that basically means that these countries own almost all of the oil on Earth, at least the reserves that we know of. The biggest members include Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, and Venezuela that we talked about. The UAE has joined, and other countries including Russia remain strategic partners to OPEC. You might be wondering, why does controlling the price of oil really matter as long as people are able to afford oil in basic necessities like driving a car or affording energy sources? It's because it has ripple effects on the entire economy, particularly inflation. Oil prices are a critical component of global inflation rates. When OPEC actions lead to higher oil prices, the cost of transportation, manufacturing, and energy rises, contributing to higher overall inflation. This can erode purchasing power and slow economic growth in oil importing countries. One of the instances we already talked about is the 1973 oil crisis. Inflation rates in many Western countries skyrocketed, leading to a period of economic stagnation, also known as stagflation. This can also have an impact on currency markets, particularly the value of the US dollar. Since oil is primarily traded in dollars, fluctuations in oil prices can impact the strength of the dollar relative to other countries. When they raise oil prices, oil importing countries must spend more of their currency to buy the same amount of oil, which can weaken their currency and strengthen the dollar. And of course, with currency also comes the global trade balances. High oil prices can widen trade deficits for countries that rely heavily on oil imports. For example, when OPEC restricts production and drives up prices, oil importing countries like Japan and India face higher import costs, negatively impacting their trade balances. Conversely, OPEC member countries often experience trade surpluses during periods of high oil prices as their export revenue increases, and they control the supply of oil very stringently because they've faced issues in the past which led to oversupply, particularly the 1980s oil glut. In the early 1980s, OPEC faced challenges from non-OPEC oil producers, particularly in the North Sea and Alaska, leading to an oversupply of oil in the global market. In response to the declining prices caused by this oversupply, OPEC attempted to reduce production to stabilize prices. Disagreements among members over quota reductions and widespread non-compliance led to further price declines, so much so that in 1986, oil prices had plummeted to around $10 per barrel, a significant drop from the highs of the 1970s. This price collapse severely impacted the economies of OPEC member countries, particularly those heavily dependent on oil revenues such as Venezuela and Nigeria. And after this, they've made sure to have more flexible production strategies and to improve coordination among members to ensure that supply stays at a level that they can afford. In simpler terms, they use this as a bargaining chip on the world stage to exert influence in world politics and make sure that they stay at the forefront of the world economic discourse. As seen in the 2008 financial crisis. In the lead up to the crisis, oil prices surged to record highs, peaking at over $147 per barrel in July 2008. This spike was driven by robust demand from emerging economies like China and India, along with speculative trading in the commodities market. OPEC members benefited from the high prices, but the subsequent financial crisis led to a sharp decline in global demand for oil, so much so that it plummeted by more than 70%, dropping to around $40 per barrel by December 2008. In response, they held emergency meetings, agreed to significantly cut production to stabilize the market, resulting in a production cut of 2.2 million barrels per day, the largest in its history at that time. This move helped prevent a further collapse in oil prices and provided some support to the global economy, but it benefited OPEC nations the most, so much so that a lot of countries accused OPEC of economic coercion. By manipulating production levels, OPEC can influence the economic stability of oil importing countries, which is the majority of countries on the planet. To counter counter this, they've formed strategic alliances, also called OPEC+. They recognize that losing support in the global economy, while still having major oil producers outside of OPEC, is a risky bargain. So they introduced OPEC+ in 2016. This alliance includes major non-OPEC producers like Russia, Mexico, and even Kazakhstan. But on the other hand, they can now also exert even more cartel-like influence on the market. By managing more of the global supply, they can influence more of the market, i.e. raise prices to what they want or cut supply to what they want. So is all hope lost? Is there no way that we can break up this cartel? Well, enter the flag bearers of freedom, the home of capitalism, the US of A, baby. The shale revolution. A boom of oil production in the US in the early 2000s has fundamentally altered the global oil landscape. Advances in hydraulic fracturing, also called fracking, and horizontal drilling have enabled the US to significantly increase its oil production. By 2018, the US had surpassed both Saudi Arabia and Russia to become the world's largest oil producer, reaching a peak of over 13 million barrels per day in late 2019. With the US no longer dependent on foreign oil and being the world's largest economy, OPEC's ability to influence global oil prices has been somewhat diminished. Although they did counter this with OPEC+, it still introduces a new challenge in aligning the interests of such a diverse group, because think about it, it's one cartel but 13 countries. Bigger countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE have greater flexibility to manage production cuts as they possess large financial reserves. In contrast, economically strained members like Venezuela or Nigeria often resist production cuts because they need immediate oil revenue to support their economies. This can lead to, once again, quota compliance issues, which in the 1980s, as we've seen, has not led to good outcomes for OPEC. And with other powerful countries now like Russia, which in the past have also refused production cuts proposed by Saudi Arabia, leading to a severe decrease in oil prices, it becomes even more tricky to navigate different styles of government and different styles of leadership. And this is not the only clash. There's been clashes between Iran and Saudi Arabia as well over production strategies, with Iran pushing for higher production to increase revenue and Saudi Arabia advocating for more conservative output to maintain price stability. And not just challenges between countries struggling for power and controlling oil supply and prices, there's also pressure from climate activists. Of course, OPEC focuses on the production and sale of fossil fuels, which is a major contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, with the recent Paris Agreement being signed in 2015, which aims to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Many countries that are oil consuming want to limit their reliance on fossil fuels. OPEC is smart. They see this change in energy consumption and also the entry of new players, not just the US but also Brazil and Canada, into the global oil market, and they're investing rapidly in energy diversification. Particularly Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, for example, includes plans to develop renewable energy sources and reduce the country's dependence on oil revenue. Although they still call for a just transition, quote unquote, meaning they want global energy policies to gradually shift away from fossil fuels because they want to consider the economies of their member nations. If you look at the facts though, this is not really happening. Solar, wind, and hydropower are growing rapidly, with global investments in renewables reaching approximately $495 billion in 2022 compared to just $275 billion in fossil fuel infrastructure. This is also supplemented by a rise in electric vehicles. By 2030, it's projected that there could be over 145 million EVs on the road globally. And as transportation shifts rapidly to EVs, not just cars but also buses and trains, this shift is already being felt, with some forecasts suggesting that oil demand for road transport could peak in the mid-2020s. So we're talking 3-4 years from now. And this is not just developed countries or the West doing this. Developing economies and leaders are also following suit, in particular China. While they still remain heavily reliant on OPEC oil, they want to aggressively invest in renewable energy and have committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2060. Their Belt and Road Initiative includes significant investments in energy infrastructure, including renewables, across Asia, Africa, and Europe, which could further reduce its long-term dependence on OPEC oil. And if there's one number to show how OPEC has declined, it's this. Their share of global oil production peaked at 55% in the 1970s. Now it is around 30% in recent years. So at this point in time, they're not controlling the majority of global oil production. With countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE already having developed economies and investing heavily in renewables and other sectors like transportation and technology, this transition away from oil domination might be easy. The same cannot be said for economies like Venezuela, Nigeria, or others that that are still heavily dependent on oil. In the case where demand for oil actually does peak in the mid-2020s or 2030s, the future for these countries post-OPEC is much more unclear. And some economists argue that this is actually the future of OPEC in a decarbonizing world. They're going to move away from fixing supply or controlling prices and may focus more on managing the decline of oil production in a way that minimizes economic disruption for its member countries. This could include investing in carbon capture and storage technologies, or even shifting towards the production of lower carbon energy sources like hydrogen. If that actually happens though, remains to be seen. Oil is still king for now, and as long as oil is king, OPEC will continue to be a cartel. As always, smash the like button, the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.